Okay, and we should be live. So I will now go to the YouTube page as well, and then I'll probably mute the YouTube page just because otherwise we'll hear ourselves double. History with Philbert live now. Right, awesome. Okay, I'll now post this link on a ton of social media.
Awesome.
Make people aware that we have actually figured out how to do this. All right, 3 watching. That should escalate in a second. Hello, evening everyone. Sorry this has taken a while. We're basically 2 boomers who have no idea how anything works, so we couldn't hear each other for the best part of 20 minutes. Can I be heard, by the way? Can everyone hear me? Can't hear you. Oh dear. Right, I really hope we can be heard.
Yeah.
I can be heard. Okay, it's fake news. You can hear me? Everyone just type yes or yeah. Yep, Yemen. Great. Yeah, awesome. Right, cool. We'll just hang around for 5 minutes, wait for people to get in. Sorry we are late if you are just joining. Everyone can hear me. Okay, brilliant. Next person to say they can't hear me gets kicked from the chat. No, I'm just kidding. All right, cool. All right, so how's everyone doing tonight? Hold on, is my feed on live? It should be. Oh, I'll send you a link to the chat so you can see the chat as well.
Yeah, no, I think I got it all set up on my end, actually.
Oh, sweet. Nice. So what are we going to do? We are basically going to talk about the Viking Age and all things Norse. There's been a recent ship burial that we're going to talk about, as well as taking some questions from you guys later on. So, by the way, my guest, if you don't know, is Noah from History of Vikings Podcast, although I'll go over this in more detail in just a minute when we get some more people in. All right. Just share the links around and then we'll get started because I realize we are a bit late already. Sing the Dutch national anthem. Oh, dear. Actually, I feel like at a milestone, so maybe 150K, I will sing the Dutch national anthem. How does that sound, Conrad? Thank you very much for your donation, but I think I'll do that for a milestone. I think that would be good. Yeah, people want to see that? Oh, dear. All right. Let me put that up, and I'll send one out on Twitter as well.
Apologies for my very loud typing.
Oh, I think we're both loud typers, to be honest. I think it's a prerequisite of being an online history person that you have to type really loudly, especially when you get into it.
Yeah.
Milestone anthem, 150K. Yeah, couldn't agree more. The Swamp Germans want their music. Great. Keyboard warriors. When are you going to start? We're going to be starting in the next couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some people to get in. Yeah, just waiting for some people to get in into the chat. And then we'll get started. I think we said like 9:30. It was meant to be 9 o'clock earlier, but we both oh, there goes my light. But yeah, we had some technical issues with live streaming because that never happens on this channel ever. Hello Vikings, who are we killing today? Nederlanders zeggen huts. All right. Okay. All right, cool. It looks like we're getting some people in now. Did you just get hit by a lamp? No, my desk lamp fell from my desk in a very ignoble fashion and knocked my phone off and everything. It's all very chaotic. Always is on this channel. Oh, just binge watch The Last Kingdom. What did you think of it, by the way? I just reread The Last Kingdom in 2 days' time. Have you watched The Last Kingdom before, Noah?
I haven't, and I should because I've heard that it's actually is that the one that's supposed to be really funny?
I think there's the comedy that's called Norseman,
That's what it
which
is.
is really good. Yeah,
No, but the Last King, the Last Kingdom, I've heard is quite good, but no, I've never watched it.
it's actually historical accuracy wise, it's interesting to say the least, but I still think it's still a cool show, I'd say. Um, which I mean, it's definitely worth watching, and I think reading is better because then you can't really read as many historical inaccuracies, which is quite nice.
Yeah, what's the author of that? Is it Bernard
Yeah, it's Bernard Cornwell.
Yeah.
He did the Sharp series as well, but he's one of my favorite authors. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it. I just really hope that before the next season, someone just walks in and tells them like all the mistakes that they're making historical accuracy wise, especially the rectangular shields. My God, the rectangular shields for the Anglo-Saxons, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, that might be a deal breaker for me.
Yeah, potentially, but if you can see past it, then it's well worth it.
Right.
All right, okay. Oh, bollocks, the lamp again. Right, I'm going to move the lamp 1 second. See, everyone talking in the chat about the lamp, and it's done it again. Honestly, I swear it can hear us. That's the microphone. Oh. Everything is falling apart. 1 second. Where's my pop filter gone? So yeah, I just knocked my mic from my table as well, and now I've lost the pop filter. Well, it's all going very, very well. Oh, hold on. It's across the floor. Okay, and then once I've put the pop filter back on, we are going to start. I promise. The lamp is not going to ruin this for us. All right. Okay. Whew. That's quite a bit of exercise. Didn't expect to do that much fighting with a lamp before getting started, but hey ho, it is what it is. Okay, so I think we should probably, without further ado, and before the lamp decides to make another move, probably get started with the live stream.
Yes, I think so.
All right, so I thought we could probably first talk about the discovery of the Viking ship in Norway, which was quite interesting. So I'm just going to get it up. I'm not sure if many of you guys heard about the Viking ship that they found in Norway recently. So it's quite interesting because the way that they found it was actually by it's using radar to find it. I think it's called geo radar. And the interesting thing is they found it, I think it was 100 meters away from a Viking museum because they knew that there was Viking activity in the area. But it's actually quite interesting because they found quite a few Viking ships there. So it's in the Oslo Fjord area, which is in the very sort of eastern part of Norway on the Swedish border or just along from the Swedish border. And yeah, it was a buried ship, so in a mound. So it's actually, it'll be really interesting to see if they do any more research into it, because at the moment they haven't dug it up yet. But I think that'll be quite an interesting one. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the new discovery, Noah?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because they found another Viking ship. I believe they called it the Hjelstad Viking ship in Norway as well. I think it was it July of 2018? It was definitely last summer, and they found it using the same technology, this ground penetrating radar. So I don't know. I get super excited thinking, because of this new technology, what else are we capable of finding? And I haven't done nearly as much reading on this new Viking ship, but it has something to do with burial mounds, doesn't it? Is it near a portion of burial mounds?
Yeah, 100%. So I think is it 11 burial mounds that are around it, and they've also found some structures of longhouses. So I think it's fair to say this would be some kind of royal site or important site for the period. And also, with what you were saying about the new technology, there have only actually been 7 Viking ships found in Norway from the period. There's only like 15 that have ever been found in all of Europe. So it's
Wow.
crazy that we found 2 within the space of a year using the same technology. So it's really exciting, that new technology. Like if they start using that around other places as well, then who knows what we're going to find. So it's really interesting. That's one of the reasons why I love this period, because with the more like technology that we're getting, the more technological advancements, the more we're going to keep finding stuff like this. So that's one really cool thing about it. And another one is that it's been found in an area in it's called the Vestfold. The fold is the Norwegian name for like the fjord that goes up to Oslo, or Oslo in English. And the interesting thing is that out of 7, they found 3 of the Viking ships in Norway from this period, in that area. So it's really cool. So it'll be interesting to see what we can learn about this area and the period of the Viking Age from these ships.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think this one was found um, by near where the famous Oseberg Viking ship, which is, gosh, where is that located? Is it the Viking Ship Museum in Norway, which I haven't had the pleasure of touring yet? But that
Yeah,
one is certainly famous. And was this in not the same county, but the neighboring county, wasn't it?
I think so. It's in the museum in Oslo. I think, was it the Oseberg ship that was found in? I think it's the Ostfold. So that's like the
Yeah.
other side. So if you, I don't know, I can't really show a map of Norway on here, I don't think. But if you see the capital of Norway is at the end of a long fjord, so essentially a long river that goes up, and then you have on each side you have the Vestfold on the western side. That's where it's the Vestfold, the western fold, and the Ostfold on the other side. And then you also have, okay, Osseberg is in Vestfold, not Ostfold, right? So Osseberg is in the Vestfold. But then I think, is it the Gokstad ship that's in Ostfold? So then I think that they found that there. And then you also have the Jelstad skip, which was found around there as well. So it's really interesting that they found so many here. And we know from sources of the time that this was a very important region because it sort of borders on the edge of where the Danes were, because we know the Danes were very influential on that side, of also on the other side of Denmark. So not just in Denmark, but also on the other side of I think it's the Skagerrak, which is the body of water there.
Mm. And the Jelstad ship, how far away was that from this new one? Because would that have been southeastern Norway?
Yeah, so I think it's not too far away. Hold on, I'll have a look if I can find a map of it. But it's not very far away, and also the famous sort of Viking trading town of Kaupang, or I think it's called Skidingshall, as well, is also near to that area. So it's all sort of happening in that region. So that's actually a really interesting development. Hold on, I'll see if I can find a map. No, I can't. Yeah, it's in that same area, which is pretty interesting. Hold on, I'll see if I can get the article up. I think I'll put the article, actually. Should I put that in the description? Because then people should be able to find it
Yeah, that might be interesting.
in the chat as well. Can I get into, or I'll put it in the comments, actually. That might work. I'll put the National Geographic article in, because I think that was a fairly good one. But yeah, it's a very interesting area, that it's quite late that that's incorporated into Norway, because obviously you have historically the story is that Harald Fairhair was the one who united Norway, but there's reason to question that as well, and to question the narrative, because Norway breaks up after his death, and then the Danes have quite a lot of control, and then there's you get Olaf Haraldsson, and then you get Olaf Tryggvason, and then you get the various other Haralds that come in. So it's quite a mixed history in Norway.
Yeah, do we have they started describing the time period in which this, well, obviously the Viking Age, but around the date range of when this ship might date back to, or is it too early to tell, really?
So they haven't yet, but if I was going to place my money on any date, it would probably be the 9th century, because I think Osseberg was dated to 834 AD, and then you have, I think, Gokstad was vaguely said to be 9th century as well. But what's important to remember with this ship is that they haven't actually gone and looked at it yet. They found it through this geo radar, but it's still inside a mound, so it's a ship that's inside of a burial mound. And also the nature of burying in mounds. Although there are examples of Christian mounds, I think, especially with a ship inside of a mound, we can fairly safely assume that that would be a pagan burial. So
Yes.
that'll be sort of before, and I think the area there was sort of thoroughly Christianized. I'd say sort of the 11th century. Starts to be Christianized around the 10th century, but so I'd say before a date of before the 11th century, but going on when these other ships have been found in the area, it's probably 9th century. So definitely before the unification of unification in strong quotation marks there, but before the unification period, that kind of area. So I think it'll be interesting to see what else they find with that.
Yeah, it will. It'll be interesting when they start digging, see what sort of grave goods, are unearthed and what we can really tell about the Vikings living in the area.
Yeah, I think that would be like really interesting to see if we do find any grave goods, because often the problem is because these were such prominent mounds, and the point was to make them prominent. They were a statement for the royal family in that area. The problem is that often that would make it a massive target for thieves as well and for grave robbers. So we'll have to wait and see if there's anything in there. But we can hope that there are.
Yeah, certainly.
All right. Yeah, thank Odin it was found in Norway and not Denmark, so I wouldn't have to struggle with the Danish pronunciation. That is definitely a good thing. I think it was the place it's found was called Borreparken, which is in my best Norwegian, of course. But yeah, hold on. Has anyone got any more questions about the ship and that kind of thing? I'll scroll up and actually have a look at the chat. What's the Lamp's channel? The Lamp hasn't got a channel yet. It's not been this naughty in a while, though. Get Time Team on it. I would love a Time Team episode on that. I am actually going to be doing a spot of archaeology over the summer, so potentially interesting if I can get some filming done there.
Ooh, that's going to be so interesting. Yeah, I'm excited to really see what happens with that and with you with doing that this summer, Hilbert. I think that'll be so fascinating. That's one thing I personally would just be so excited to do.
Yeah, I think it'd be definitely worthwhile to do, because I obviously talk about archaeological stuff a lot, but it'd be interesting to be sort of at the forefront, actually digging stuff up and taking it out and having a look. How many men could fit on this boat? I think they said it was around 20 meters, which is a similar size to the other ships that have been found, but it's still a fairly substantial boat. So I'm not sure how many men that would translate to. But I think what's the average amount of men in a boat? I think it's 40 is for the largest ships usually, that they say, if I can remember correctly. But yeah, I think there's about 40 men that they say to a Viking ship. Correct me if I'm wrong, because that's off. Is it a long ship? Yeah, it's a long ship, based on the form at least. Restart Time Commanders and get Hilbert and Noah to face off. That would be an interesting
one. That was such a good show.
Definitely.
Yeah, are you familiar with that show, Hilbert?
I feel like I have watched episodes of it, but it's been a while. I don't know if you can refresh my memory on it.
Yeah, so basically what it was, and you'll have to correct me in the chat, but basically what it was is it was a team of historians. One of my favorite historians, Mike Lodes, was featured in that program. TV series, and basically what they did is, although I don't think they mentioned the games by name, they did battle simulations using Total War games. So you would have two teams, and they would each play as a certain faction, and they would recreate historic battles via the Total War game engine. It was fascinating to watch.
Oh, that actually sounds pretty cool. I should probably do that for like over the summer. I'm thinking about getting a decent PC, and I'm thinking about maybe doing some videos about battles and things like that with like Total War footage to make it a bit spicier.
Yes.
I don't know if that'd be something people would be interested in.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, that game engine really is quite remarkable. I mean, I've played the Total War games for many years, and I've seen other YouTubers incorporate it into their YouTube videos, and I think it's turned out really cool.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm definitely going to have a look at that, because I think now with what was it? You've got Total War Attila, and then you have the expansion that's just sort of about the British Isles during the Dark Ages, and lots of people recommended it to me, but unfortunately I haven't had the time to really go into it yet. But I think that'll be a really fun thing to do, to add into videos, you know.
Yeah, no doubt. And Thrones of Britannia, that was kind of their new one that they released this time last year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which was of course the Viking Age.
Yeah, no, I think that'll be really good to do. Right, hold on, let me get my phone. And I think we should answer some questions. So
Let's do it.
quite a lot of people submitted some questions, so I think it'll be fun to have a look at what some of them were. Let me open it up. So I can see some questions being asked in the chat already, and actually quite a few of them have been asked. So I think we'll get through a few of the ones that were submitted on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and then we'll answer some sort of live from the chat if people are interested. So the first one I thought we would discuss is what were Viking marriage rituals? I don't know if you know much about that, Noah.
Yeah, Viking marriage rituals. So in pre-Christian Scandinavia, I guess marriage was, in essence, just a commercial contract between two families. This concept of marrying for love, of course, this is something which is common throughout history. Would it not have really existed in most marriages? It would have been sort of organized by the families. The bride and groom would have been of similar social status, and actually the groom or the groom's father would have been the party to initiate the marriage proposal. Neither the bride nor the bride's father could, make some sort of marriage proposal or create a marriage contract. But women during the Viking Age did, of course, have the right to divorce. And as many people know, they enjoyed common rights, not all rights, but when compared with other medieval contemporaries, women during the Viking Age enjoyed many rights that other societies did not. But marriage would have been, very set in stone, very, very much a sort of business exchange, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely kind of the idea you get, because a lot of a marriage as well was quite business related. So you had money changing hands. So you've got the dowry, which is then from the bride's family to the groom's family. And the reason why this was because generally in the Viking Age, I think women's social position was higher than that of men. So one interesting theory for the start of the Viking Age is because of there's fewer women kicking around in Scandinavia than men. Several reasons for this. One is possibly because of women being exposed more, so that this was a pagan practice where you'd put babies out, and apparently this happened to girls more than it did to boys. What this essentially did was that there'd be more demand for women than for men, which is possibly why you get so many men going abroad. One of the things we see in Iceland, for example, with the DNA is that the mitochondrial DNA, so passed from mother to mother, is largely from the Hebrides and from Scotland and Ireland. Which then suggests that men were going over, taking women from the local population and settling down. So, being the availability of women possibly was a very big Kickstarter for the Viking Age. And also, because of this meant that women, they would generally marry across in social order or up. So generally, you'd have a woman of one status would marry a man of a higher status. And because of this, the bride's family would then pay a dowry, which in the Old Norse was heimanfylgja, which is the bride price that would be paid, as well as then the groom's family would also pay. I think it's called a mundi in Old Norse, or mundur, which is the price that was paid across. So that's why you have that interesting dynamic there. And this would all be arranged before the marriage by delegates of the groom's family who would meet. And really, with what we see today with a wedding, is that's the one big occasion, and after that, it's all done. But in Old Norse society, you'd probably have several of these feasts going on and rituals that would be had, possibly swearing oaths on gods and things like this, although not much of this remains. But it is interesting to see the marriage, as you say, Noah, as more of sort of a business contract between two families, because it is, of course, a strengthening of alliances. And often this would be in favor of the bride's family because of the higher demand of women in the Viking Age.
Yeah, certainly. And one interesting tidbit to note is that, I think people would have been married at certainly pretty younger ages than they are now. I mean, our evidence for marriage during the Viking Age is unfortunately limited, as is evidence for most things during the Viking Age when compared with other historical topics. However, the Saga of Icelanders, which I'm sure we could get into the sagas later, which I would just say I would treat those as a sort of historical fiction. There are many instances where girls are married off at the young age of 12, and this is considered to be normal. There's no questioning of this whatsoever.
Yeah, definitely. I think the sagas are interesting because they're not to go down the rabbit hole of the sagas too much, but they're obviously written a bit later, so a few centuries after the end of the Viking Age. But society hasn't moved on that much that it's probably not recognizable for the Viking Age and what we understand went on. So in a way, it's a very useful source, but we should always sort of keep in mind the differences between the two. But what you say is absolutely right, that girls would marry generally much younger. And today we kind of look back and go, oh God, the pedophiles. But if you think people are only, surviving up into their 40s, 50s, life was hard. And girls could get pregnant at that age, then that's sort of what they did, and that's what continued up until you get things like the sexual revolution and people living longer. That was the norm back then.
Yeah,
Not saying that
certainly.
I believe it's right, but that's just explaining history rather than taking a side on it.
Right. Yeah, it certainly was. And that's interesting that you mentioned that because, yeah, the normal life expectancy for Scandinavians during the Viking Age was, between the ages of, late 30s and 40s, which nowadays it's, over double that easily
Mm.
in the United States and in Europe, certainly, which is super interesting. And it's funny you mentioned the rabbit hole of the sagas because it certainly is.
Definitely. All right, so I think we've touched on Viking marriages now. So now let's go to something else. Another question that I got asked, which was, how did the Vikings train for battle? So this is quite an interesting one because obviously the Vikings sort of arrive on the European scene, and for a while they sort of go around willy nilly, and for a long time they are very very feared fighters, and they seem to do very well on the battlefield. So kind of the question is, well, how did they train for this? And I think this would largely depend on your social status. So I think if you were from a poorer background, from the binder or from the bonde, which are like the peasant classes, that fighting isn't your first thing that you're going to be training for. Although I think in certain skills you probably would potentially be good with a bow, and you have various sports that go on. So like Glima, for example, I can see it being mentioned. You have wrestling that's being practiced and things like that, as well as swimming and throwing javelins, spears, archery competitions. So these competitions and hunting, even for the higher classes, especially against boar and things like that, is in a way it's a simulation of combat. So that would all be some form of training. And I think it's fair to say as well, in Anglo-Saxon England, you have the Fjord, which is the sort of regional militia that would spring up. And later on in Norway, you get things, I think it's called the Skipfelager.
Mm.
I believe it's which king was it under again? I can't remember. I think it was one of the Harolds that you then get sort of these different. You have ships like I forget the name. I think Leither is the Old Norse term when you get these kind of regional militias, and I think they would then have some sort of training. And before that, I think you would have among the peasant classes some kind of fairly regular training for warfare for when they would be called up, maybe when another petty kingdom would attack. But I think it's in the royal classes, the higher classes, the nobility, that they were trained from a young age in various martial arts with various weapons, and that they would then go on and become the huskarla, so the housecarls, as well as sort of the retainers of jarls and things like that. I'm not sure if you want to share any light on this, because I think you know a fair amount about kind of the social status and warfare and things like that.
Yeah.
Noah.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so in terms of how did the Vikings train for battle, again, I think our evidence for this is just abysmally limited.
Mm,
But one thing I can tell you, and this is seen throughout Scandinavian history, right up until really, I mean, the early, the early 20th century. I just think it was innately physical. I mean, people would have been physically fit. People would have been.
mm.
I mean, apart from diseases, which thank God we don't have nowadays, pretty healthy, but it would have been super physical. Boys would have been participating in activities like hunting, fishing, skiing, actually, sledding, all of these very physical activities. Archery, skills with, knives and swords at very young ages. So I think even somebody who wasn't a warrior, a Scandinavian, would have been very skilled and very well versed in the ability to defend oneself. But in terms of training during the Viking Age, that's a really interesting question. I know a great deal about how sort of Viking militaries were set up, but in terms of training, no, that's an interesting question, which I don't know nearly enough about as I should.
No, I think you shed an interesting light on it there. That obviously the existence would be very physical. So not like today, you'd often be out in the field, you'd be farming. So kind of the kind of strength kind of average would be a lot higher than today. And I think as well with Scandinavia is that it was quite a hostile society. I think that's one of the reasons that one of the ways that the Viking Age is described is that it's a sort of an increasing hostility between various peoples at this time, partially because of maybe overpopulation. There's too much space, or again, fighting over women or fighting over gold, that there wasn't enough silver going around. So I think people would generally have to deal with violence from a fairly young age, which of course first-hand experience, there's nothing like experience. Also being told by old warriors how to fight and things like that. So I think that's probably sort of how they would train back then for combat. And then obviously when you were I think part of a higher class, we do have evidence of sort of wooden weapons being used and things like that to train with, so that they wouldn't just train with sharp objects and things like that.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Yes, certainly. And defending all sorts of things, family
Mm,
honor, reputation, blood feuds were very common during that time period. And these sagas are certainly a claim of evidence to that notion. But yeah,
definitely.
yeah, it's very interesting.
Mm. So, to move on to slightly something else, a bit of a different question is where did the Vikings come from? So, sort of countries wise, because there's sometimes you see things that they're like, oh, they came from Denmark and Norway, and sometimes you add in Sweden, and then other times they're like, oh, Finland as well. So really, with the Viking Age, often what's meant is that they came from Denmark and Norway, but then of course Norway actually extends right the way up and has I believe it has a border with Russia right at the top. So really, when we're talking about Norway, it's the etymology of the word helps us to understand where they would have come from. So Norway comes from Norverkir, which is the north way. So it's the way to the north. And essentially, you had a strip that was often considered part of Denmark that we just talked about, so around the Oslo fjord. And then you have around the edges and up until about sort of halfway the distance of Norway, when you got people that we would consider Vikings of that culture. And further north, you had people that I believe the Vikings called the Lapps, who are the Sami. And then also in areas of Sweden, you'd have these peoples in the Arctic Circle, and then in Finland as well. So I'd say really the areas where we find Vikings would be throughout Denmark, throughout these regions in Norway, and as well in Sweden. We have two peoples that are really known to us: the Svear, who of course would go on to name Sweden, and the Jotard, who are often seen as being potentially related to the Goths, but a big question about that.
Yeah, certainly. No, that's absolutely right. And I think it's interesting to note that, the Vikings are known for being able to see so much of the world. And the Viking Age was a time of great trade and conquest and discovery. The Vikings would have gone on to discover Greenland, Iceland, and the first Europeans to discover North America.
Mm.
But, depending on what area of Scandinavia they came from, that's kind of what determined which Vikings went where. So, the Scandinavians living in Sweden would have been primarily the people, sailing down the Volga River and trading over in what is modern day Russia. And then, I believe it was primarily Scandinavians from Norway, and actually even the British Isles would have been the lot who went on to discover and settle Iceland, and then
Mm.
a lot of Danes in the British Isles.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's and sort of geography kind of determines this a lot, because if you look at a map, Norway, it's kind of exactly on the line from Norway that you find areas like Iceland, and then obviously Greenland later on, and the Faroe Islands, because the first place that they really went after Norway was the Faroe Islands that they discovered, which is called the Sheep Isles, which is interesting enough. But if you sail across from Norway, you can see how you could accidentally miss the headland, miss Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes, and then end up on Iceland. But then obviously with the Danes, the Danish are more across from England. They'd probably have more trading contact with England as well, because you could go down the coast past Frisia, and trade with England fairly easily, even before they had craft that could go straight across the North Sea. So that sort of explains that connection, as well as them being connected to several of the Baltic tribes, the Wends, for example, and then the Swedish as well, going down the great rivers in the east. Again, it makes sense because they would have to sort of go through areas that were controlled by Danish principalities and chieftains and Norwegians to get to the west. So of course they would go east across into areas like that are now Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic states. So it really is quite interesting that the geography sort of determines where they went and what they did.
No doubt. Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah, just sort of the different, just the different, because, a lot of people who don't understand anything about Viking Age see Scandinavians as being sort of, for lack of a better term, a unified destructive force. But even there would have been raiding and trading among the different Scandinavian, militant groups and different villages and towns. Everything was very divided back then.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it'd be interesting to sort of look back and think how these hostilities would have developed as there was more centralization and how that kind of shaped what happened during this period.
Yeah, no doubt.
So another question that I was given was, well, I've kind of combined a few questions here, but one was about the Vikings in Spain and what they did there, and then another was contact between Arab countries and the Vikings, and also with Africa. But I think Noah, you recently did a podcast about Ibn Fadlan, the Arabic trader from, I think it's the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yes, I did. Yeah, that is something which has fascinated me. And, in terms of understanding, I guess, this notion of who the Vikings were and what the Viking Age is all about, I think that it's important to realize that the Vikings really were unprecedented in terms of any of their European predecessors, in that, as I mentioned before, they were able to see and discover and experience so much of the world, and their relationships with places so far away like Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate is just a testament to that. So one thing that is really interesting to me, an interesting piece of evidence for sort of the Arabic world during the Viking Age, is the massive number of Arabic silver coins that have been discovered throughout Scandinavia. I think it's something like 80,000 silver coins have been discovered on the tiny island of Gotland off the coast of Sweden alone.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and of course, these would have come there to Scandinavia through, trade. We're safe to assume that, but also because of the just large volume of coins that have been there, we can rightfully assume that this would have been probably a sort of tribute money as well. The Vikings were notorious for extracting tribute payments, mostly in the form of, silver hoards. From those who they attacked and those who they invaded. But you mentioned Ibn Fadlan. He is certainly a fascinating historical figure. He was an Arab diplomat sent on behalf of the Caliphate to deliver a message to someone in what is sort of the modern day Russia, Eastern Europe, Bulgarian area. And he basically kept, well, it's now a book, The Journeys of Ibn Fadlan. You can pick it up really on Amazon or anywhere. And it was basically a travel log of his journey. And he met these interesting people who he called the Rus. And that is, of course, where modern Russia gets his name. There's a great amount of debate as to the ethnicity of these people, but we can all assume that they are at least partially Scandinavian origin. He describes them having, dark ink all over their bodies, which we understand as being tattoos, worshiping, sort of wooden pendants and these miniature statues, which we can understand as being pagan gods. But Ibn Fadlan is a very interesting man. And yeah, I do highly recommend, rather self-righteously, that you do listen to my episode on Ibn Fadlan with Dr. James Montgomery of the University of Cambridge. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Yeah, no, I definitely recommend that you do listen to it, because honestly, Noah, your podcast I'd say it's my favorite podcast out there, followed closely by the History of English podcast, probably just because you get so many experts on to talk about this and you have a great interviewing style. So if you haven't checked out History of Vikings podcast, I would honestly highly recommend it, because basically I think pretty much every Vikings expert that's alive right now has been on there or close to that sort of milestone. So I honestly couldn't recommend it more, because you go into really great detail about all sorts of different questions about the Viking Age. So honestly, I'll definitely leave a link to that in the description after this is uploaded, so you can follow that. And as well, one of the interesting things that you mentioned was about the tribute that was taken from these various peoples. So in the east, the Arabic dirhams, they would often come up the rivers. So you have the Volga and the Dnieper in Russia and in Ukraine today. And these would often be taken from various peoples that the Rus, so these Swedes mostly that would be established in the east, would have taken. But you also get tribute being exacted from the English. So actually, I have a series of videos coming on Athelred, King Athelred, who's often called the Unready. And during his time, you get a shit ton, there's no other way to say it, but a shit ton of money that comes from England. And you get absolutely lots of it found in hoards in Scandinavia. And this is where we get lots of evidence about English coins. There's been far more English coins found in Scandinavia from this period than in England. So it's just incredible that they exacted so much money. But it says quite a lot about how they made their money and then what they did with it, which is really quite an interesting thing.
It is silver pennies, a great number of English silver pennies, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. I think the penningas of Athelred, and then you get all sorts of different designs and things in the coinage. But we get so many from his period that it's really quite interesting to have a look back at that stuff. And that's what I'm going to focus on in a few videos that I've got coming on King Athelred and the coinage. If you are interested in coins, then I'd highly recommend checking out a chap called Rory Naismith. I think you've done an interview with him already, haven't you?
I have. Yes, I have.
Yeah, so I'd definitely check that out if you're interested in coins. Coins are one of my favorite little hobbies from history because we can learn an awful lot from coins. And you get to use a fun term, which is numismatics, which is the study of coins in history. Okay, so kind of the so we went sort of straight to like the Arabic section, but also was asked about Spain. So we actually get a very interesting story about Spain, which is Björn Ironside or Jarnsida in Old Norse, who is one of the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, who goes around Spain and has this great journey into the Mediterranean. And I actually made a video about this fairly recently, where I cover both the Vikings in the east and then the ones going to through the Mediterranean. And I think this was in the 850s that he went. And there's all sorts of stories how they raid various towns in the south of Spain. And now the interesting thing is that obviously Spain in the early 8th century already had been invaded by the Moors, so a Muslim people who had invaded through North Africa. And then they invaded into Spain. And this had already happened by the time the Danes got there. So they would have interacted with people, and they would have first interacted with people of the Islamic faith there, which was interesting how they interacted with those, which seems to have been in sort of the same ways with Christians. They extorted money, they killed people, they took slaves, and they took booty, that kind of thing. So it's quite interesting there. I'm not sure if there's much evidence of them being used as mercenaries by people in Spain, by the Moors there, but they definitely were used as mercenaries by the Byzantines, by the Varangians, and they fought against Arabs there. I think Harold Hadrada is famous. There's a big poem about him, about how many of these Arabic strongholds that he managed to take in the region of the Holy Land. So Palestina and then other areas in North Africa that had fallen to Muslim invaders at this time. So it's interesting that Harold Hadrada, before obviously going and becoming king in Norway, he was, yeeting around the Mediterranean with a fleet and capturing all these Arabic strongholds.
Yes, that's certainly King Harold Hardrada's saga, as featured in the collection of sagas of the Norwegian and Swedish kings known as Heimskringla, is a fascinating read. I had the pleasure of reading it again myself a few weeks ago, and he really got his start as leader of the Varangian Guard, and patrolling around sort of the islands in Greece and what is understood as modern day Greece. And he might have done something in sort of the Asia Minor, Turkey area, if I'm not mistaken. I could be totally wrong, but
yeah, I think so. I think is it too early for the Turks? I think because there's definitely a story of the Varangians fighting the Turks, where they're all, is it the Battle of Manzikert, where they're all killed around the feet of the emperor, which is quite interesting. But they definitely would have been fighting the enemies of the Byzantines. So often that would be steppe peoples, semi-nomadic peoples, who they'd be fighting sort of in the Caucasus. Is it the Caucasus region? Am I right in thinking that's the Caucasus? Potentially. So sort of the kind of area of the Ukraine, you had various steppe peoples there, but also, like you said, in Asia Minor. Sorry, I just got a bit of echo. So in kind of Asia Minor, fighting peoples like the Turks and various Muslim invaders there. Let's have a look. Okay, so another question, kind of in a similar vein, is about whether we would consider the Crusader states. So I think it's Edessa and the one around Antioch, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and also the Norman conquests as Viking kingdoms or not. What do you think, Noah? Do you think we should sort of class these kind of conquests that are late 11th centuries being Viking, or do you think there's some kind of divide between them?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I would consider those as being Vikings simply because those occurred at a time when, I mean, the Viking Age had very much ended. We can really get all fussy about the exact date the Viking Age ended, but around 1066 with the Battle of Hastings. And in terms of understanding again who the Vikings were, I'm not one of these people that gets very pedantic about the use of the word Viking, but we should bear in the back of our minds that when describing medieval Scandinavians, not all of them would have fit the description as Vikings. That is to say that it's an activity, not really an ethnicity. The word Viking is sort of a job description used to describe those medieval Scandinavians and Icelanders who went off raiding and pillaging and trading and doing the things the Vikings are most famous for doing. But the Viking Age had very much ended. I would argue that it ended with the formation of sort of nation states, as it were, this formation of kingdoms and what would eventually become proper countries. I wouldn't say the spread of Christianity ended the Viking Age, but it was sort of a coincidence, one that was not arbitrary, and it goes with the formation of nation states. Comes Christianity, this idea of Scandinavian rulers trying to fit in among the rest of Europe's elite and giving their followers the gift of Christianity in exchange, actually, for their loyalty.
Yeah, and it's interesting that when you get Christianization occurring, often you get more violence, not less, from the heathen period. So some of the saints, the Saint Olaf in Norway, was famous for his very bloody reprisal of pagans and torturing people who didn't convert and all of this. And you also get, very interestingly enough, the first Christian king of Denmark was Harald Bluetooth. And his sons, actually, Svein Forkbeard and then Knut Hinrike, which is Knut the Great, you might know him as, they are famous for their launching invasions of England. So really, they were the first Christian kings of Denmark. But they are massively famous for their, attacks and their raids. And even into sort of the, several generations in, you still had them using the same activity. Harald Hardrada, he was a Christian. And, there had been Christian kings in Norway since arguably Haakon, who is a 10th century ruler. But you did have spots of paganism in between with, I think it's, what's his face? I think it's Jarl. Is he called Haakon as well? Or Haakon Sigurdsson, who is the Earl of Larder. I think, is it Haakon? I can't remember. There's a lot of Haakons. He brought back paganism, but really the introduction of Christianity didn't change the lifestyle that much. You still had these people going out and raiding. Although I think, as you say, centralization is a much bigger change. Although arguably it's just centralization, which means bigger raids, better organized raids, rather than that the raids stop altogether. And also you then get that instead of just being a hit and run attack, it's that a fleet lands and invades an area, which is what happens with England, for example.
Yes, and the embracing of proper uniform armies, united around one central cause, not really these sort of like kinship communities of warriors.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's a very interesting question. Some sort of varying dates for the end of the Viking Age vary massively. 1066 is often given, but there's no real. There's the Battle of Stamford Bridge when Harald Hardrada is killed, and that's the last. But it's not the last time that a Scandinavian king tries to capture the British Isles, tries to capture anywhere there, for example. You still get that continuing on, and arguably you could say that it goes up into the 1500s when Greenland is abandoned as a colony. I think that's when Judith Yesh suggests that it potentially ended. But then again, 1500, who else is going to put the end of the Viking Age in 1500? Clearly that feels wrong. But 1066 is only a date that's significant in England. You know, you might put 1014 as the date in Ireland with the Battle of Clontarf, but then you still have Scandinavians ruling in Dublin up into the 12th century. So it's, you know, it's a big question, and I don't think there is one date. I think it's more of a transition that happens away from the Viking Age into more centralization.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
All right, so let's have a look at another question. Oh, this is a spicy one. Were Shieldmaidens a regular occurrence? What's your opinion on Shieldmaidens and the recent kind of upsurge in people finding Shieldmaidens or warrior women, that kind of thing?
Yeah, what's my opinion on Shieldmaidens? That's certainly a very interesting question. I mean, we could get into the logistics surrounding the archaeology, which I have on my podcast many times, actually. You know, it's interesting. You know, I think people. I think people need to really look at all sides of the spectrum, and I think we need to be careful that there's no wishful thinking going on here. Kind of like if we discover a Viking Age burial and it's a burial of, you know, what appears to be a woman, and there happens to be a sword lying right next to the skeleton, that does not in any way suggest that skeleton is, you know, what we would consider a shield maiden, because it's kind of interesting. The dead do not really have any say in what they're buried with. You know, perhaps
Very true.
perhaps that is the daughter of a chieftain or the daughter of a great warrior prince or something like that, you know, and a sword would have, and I mean, swords in general, I'm just focusing on one weapon one type of weapon that has been found in archaeological excavations. The sword would have been very much sort of an heirloom to begin with. To make a sword during the Viking Age was something which required a lot of metal and a lot of skill, both of which were very cost ineffective. So swords would have been passed down generation after generation.
And I think as well, if I could just interject there as well, with a sword, you often get references in Beowulf, for example, of a sword being something that oaths were sworn on. So swords are much more than just a weapon; they're a symbol of power. So, say if you had a woman in power buried with a sword, perhaps it's not reminiscent of her being a warrior. I mean, it could be, but it could also be that people swore an oath on the sword to her, which is clearly, if a woman is buried with a sword, she's a high status individual. So we could also see it in that lens. But sorry for interrupting. Please carry on.
No. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so my opinion on shield maidens, I mean, gosh, I don't know. It's interesting. It's fascinating. If we're to, you know, argue for, you know, hours on end about the sagas and whether they can be used as a historical source for the Viking Age, I mean, there are certainly, you know, warrior women featured in the sagas, but then there's mythological characters like Odin and Valkyries and, you know, all of these other mythological, concepts featured in the sagas, which, you know, are very difficult to envision as being real occurrences, I would say.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
I think the way to view it is that it's more a rare occurrence, that it wouldn't be the norm. Although I think it would be unwise to say that it never happened, because I think it probably definitely did happen at some points. I think there's the one saga story as well. I think it's is it Vikings in the East, where you get women fighting, but that's because it's a last ditch defense. And then you get the one in North America. Was it what's she called? I think it's Thorgilsdottir, who then, you know, she bares her bare breast at the Native Americans attacking and chases them off with a sword. But then that's a humorous occurrence. That's a noteworthy occurrence. And I think there's several that it's sort of taboo as well. For there were definite gender roles during this period, and it was taboo to cross from one to the other. So one insult that's often leveled at Odin is that he uses Seidr, and Seidr is a kind of magic, but that this magic is usually it's seen as a woman's magic, and that's something that Odin is ashamed of and is mocked for, that he uses this woman's magic. If you want a citation for that, that's in several of Jackson Crawford's videos. He is a professor of Old Norse and various Norse studies, so he's done quite a lot looking at that side of things from the textual. And if you want a good video, I thought, on sort of the archaeological facts, then there is a post by Judith Yesh. I think she's written one or two very good articles about women in the Viking Age and warriors, and how we need to consider sort of more than just, oh, there's a sword, she's a warrior. And as well, Survive the Jive made a really good video about that as well, and about the recent the recent discoveries there. And I thought one more point, if to just bring that out, that he made that was very good, was that we often find children buried with weapons and with chess sets, because a lot of people said, oh, there was a chess set in a grave. That must mean that she was a statistician, that she was a tactician, that she was a general planning war. And I'm thinking it's just a chess set. Like, people played half and taffel and chess because they wanted to play a game and to, pass through the winter. And we often find children buried with these things, but we're obviously not going to argue that there were child soldiers fighting in the Viking ranks. That would be preposterous. So I'm not saying that it never happened. It probably did happen at some point, but I think we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions to fit with modern political agendas, whether that's a right-wing agenda or a left-wing agenda being used. I'm not sure if you have any more you'd like to say about that, Noah.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I absolutely agree. Yeah, it's important to really look at all sides of it. It's important to look at the literature available. It's important to look at the archaeological evidence available, and it's important to grasp a wholesome understanding of just life during the Viking Age, what women were expected to do, what men were expected to do, and really compare and contrast the evidence available, because there's certainly a lot of speculation, and I think it's all in good fun. I think it's fascinating. I think it'd be really cool if there were Shieldmaidens. I'm not saying there is. I'm not really saying there's not. I'd have to do more research on it myself, but that's something I intend to do a few podcast episodes on this year.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's good that people are getting involved and interested. It's just when people watch something like Vikings and they see sort of regiments of warrior women, and then they go online and they're like, this is a fact because I saw it in Vikings. I think it's good that they're getting involved and getting interested in this. I would highly recommend that. But obviously we need to just kind of sit down and take the facts as they are and sort of think with a cool head, rather than just thinking with, oh, that would be so cool if that was the case,
Absolutely.
Okay, so another really interesting question, and to go before the Viking Age, is what was there before the Viking Age in Scandinavia? What kind of age do we have? And this is actually a very interesting question, because in many ways this sort of answers another question that's related to one we just looked at, which was the end of the Viking Age. So sort of what starts the Viking Age? Noah, do you have a date that you would say that starts the Viking Age? Are you a traditionalist going 793 attack on Lindisfarne, that's bang, that's the start of the Viking Age, or would you have another answer for when it kind of starts and for what the reasons are that the Viking Age kicks off the way it does when it does?
It's really interesting because before the Viking Age, which, arguably started in around, in the year 793 or somewhere around that, we really don't know a great deal about the peoples of Scandinavia during the early Middle Ages. I mean, we know some, but we don't know a ton of details. And that's because the, sort of Roman and Greek antiquarian historians never, and explorers never really made it that far north. I mean, some did, and certainly you had people like Tacitus describing Germanic tribes, but as far north as Scandinavia, which we understand as being the core of the Viking homeland, you didn't really have people that going that far north. So when the Viking Age begins, 793, raid of Lindisfarne came as a shock to the peoples of Christian Europe. That was indeed probably the first major Viking raid. It's the one that people really started writing about. There are accounts of there being some raids before then. But one thing that's interesting to note is, and I indeed, I just mentioned it, we see the raid of Lindisfarne as being a shock to the Christian peoples of Europe, and those who write about it, the victims, the Christian monks. I mean, the famous scholar Alcuin of York, obviously of York in northern England, describes it as being just this preposterous, God is punishing us, and it's just this very dramatic display. But the Vikings were also great traders, which we need to keep in mind. And raid and trade, I think, would have been linked more than we would like to separate in our minds. The Vikings didn't just come from nowhere. They had trade relationships. Monasteries acted as local depository banks. Monks needed precious stones to decorate their vellum illuminated manuscripts.
Mm.
So these monasteries would have been very much sort of miniature trade hubs, and the Vikings would have been well aware of which monasteries were where and which ones were undefended, which was virtually all of them.
Oh yeah, and in a talk I had with Max Adams, who's an author and historian as well, is that he said that it's very likely that the men who raided Lindisfarne probably had been there, that the monks already knew who they were because they traded with them before, but that it was just an escalation of hostilities between various people in the North Sea region, because obviously they were trading around, and as you say, the distinction between trade and raid isn't that much, and you might be thinking, well, how can trading and raiding, they're clearly very different. One is that both parties are on equal footing and that they're trading for things, and one's getting something in return for giving something away, and raiding is just taking it. But if you think about it, if you have, let's say, 40 big burly Scandinavians with axes coming to your little hovel and saying, "Ooh, that's nice, let's trade," how much option do you have to trade? Yeah, trading, if you spell it like that, it's kind of the in between trading and raiding. So you really have to wonder, what's the distinction? And also that you might get them raiding in one village, but then if they come to a well-defended settlement, they might think, okay, let's take the beast-head prows off, let's put the shields inside, and let's trade, because otherwise we'll lose too many men. So I think that's a very good point that you raise, is that it's a lot more nuanced than we would be led to believe just by contemporary sources, written sources of the period.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. That conclusion that Max Adams had, I think that's entirely possible.
Yeah, that's true. And definitely the difference is whether tea is offered or not, as the Americans would know, I'm sure. But to go back slightly to the question, because I feel like we talked about sort of the nature of Viking raiding and trading and that kind of thing. But what came before the Vikings in Scandinavia? So if we think about Scandinavia, you obviously get the same sort of, it's very connected. So in the Bronze Age, you have Scandinavia is connected to all of these trade lanes in Europe. So the main trade lane at that time would be the people we now refer to as the Celts. So in, I believe it's Switzerland, the Latin culture that's trading from Switzerland goes up the trade lane. So the British Isles are involved because they have, I believe it's tin from Cornwall that's made the British Isles a very attractive place for getting tin, because obviously you need tin and copper to make bronze. And then you have the Bronze Age with these various elites, and in Scandinavia we see this with burial mounds and things like that. But then later on, as you go into the Iron Age, Scandinavia kind of falls outside of this trading network, and you see sort of a recession happening in Scandinavia where people sort of become poorer. They're left outside of the trading lanes because obviously the situation changed. But then with the Romans, they obviously became on the frontier of the Roman Empire. Scandinavia was never conquered by the Romans, but there were definitely Scandinavians who fought in the Legion, and we see Mediterranean influences coming into the culture in Scandinavia. So that's sort of what comes before. And then obviously with the fall of the Roman Empire, you get the migration period and various peoples moving around. And that's really when we get much more hostile, that people start to fight. And we start to see this in the development of the rowing ships that are seen on various rock carvings and with ship burials made with stone and things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's kind of an interesting development, is the ship, because of course the Viking ship is one of their most important tools. And what I recently wrote an essay on this kind of topic, and what's interesting about the ship is that if you think of all the petty kingdoms that you have and all these chieftains and tribes next to each other, of course you can only be attacked really by the tribes around you. So say you have 3 tribes around you, then it means you can be attacked from 3. And let's say you have marriage alliances with 2, that means you can only expect attack from 1. But let's say now that a tribe in the far north has invented this ship that they can, these warships, these longships that they've recently discovered another one of in Norway. Now you can be attacked by literally anyone who is within, let's say, a week's sail from your land. So that suddenly meant that, oh heck, we can be attacked by anyone. So that drive is there for more centralization. And as these ships get better, and then we get things like the sail coming in, and obviously they can be rowed too, then they'd be able to raid further and further afield, which is probably, I think they went east first, is where they went across the Baltic, the Swedes, and then later we get them going across the North Sea. Possibly one of the reasons for that is the Frankish expansion. So obviously they expanded into Frisia in the, let's say, the early 8th century and later 8th century. And then also the annexation of Saxony, the Saxons with Widukind and the Saxon Revolt, put them literally at the southern border of Denmark. So it's quite possibly an exclusion again from trade. So a repeating of what happened in the Iron Age, that they were excluded from the trade lanes because the Franks were Christian. They were probably enforcing that rule so that the peoples under their control, the Frisians who had been heathen, probably would have no qualms with trading with the Danes and other people. But now with these Christianization, obviously the Anglo-Saxons in England were Christian as well. This would probably have left the Scandinavians feeling left out. But that might be why they then go, well, if we can't trade it, why not raid it? And I think that should be a slogan for the Vikings. If you can't trade it, raid it. But I think that's at least in a very summed up, oversimplified way, the start of the Viking Age and how that all kicks off. Some factors to consider there.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really well said. And I agree. If you can't trade it, raid it. I don't know. I should get some podcast that says something like that.
Yeah, I think so the Vikings, so Black Friday, am I right? But, something remained. All right, let's have a look. Let's have a look at some other questions. Do you know what? Why don't we take some questions from the live chat? So does anyone have any questions about put it on a t-shirt? I think you should definitely incorporate that into some of your memes. Goat worn armband. It's a great meme page, by the way, on Facebook. Goat worn armband. Type it in on Facebook and you'll find some great Dark Age memes.
Oh, awesome. I love memes and I love historical memes. So I'll be checking
definitely. It's the best combination. Halfdan was here. Where might the name Malgrun come from? The earliest patrilineal ancestor I know of is Malgrun de Smethton. Where do you know where that name is from? Like what sort of geographic region? Malgrun de Smethton. I'm guessing Smethton is Smith Village.
Yeah, you are good on place names, Hilbert. So you probably know that better than I do.
No, I know little bits and bobs, but North Yorkshire. Okay, I have to say I've never heard of Malgrun, but I can look into it for you if you'd like, if that'd be something you're interested in, because I'm curious now. Malgrun de Smethton. I'm not sure if that might be a name that's still there and a place name. Okay, what were the relations like between the Vikings and the Finns? Do you know much about Finnic Viking interaction during the period, Noah?
Yeah, Finadian Moose. That's a really cool name. Well, I personally have a great affinity for the country of Finland. Indeed, it is one of my favorite sort of historical regions to study. And I've done some research on this. I've been wanting to do a podcast episode on it for some time, but honestly, nothing really notable. I mean, Finland at the time would have been extremely underdeveloped when compared to Scandinavia, very, very rural. However, during the Viking Age, it would have seen the emergence of more sort of larger villages, towns, certainly along the coastline in southern Finland, certainly around sort of the Karelian Isthmus and the region that is nowadays Karelia. The Sami people are mentioned a few times in the various sagas, which is really interesting. The Vikings likely crossed through Finland or had something to do with Finland. Their trade routes would have intersected through the modern day country. So we have found some Viking Age swords, some Viking Age silver in Finland. So I think that's likely sort of a product of their trade, but honestly, nothing extremely and particularly notable, especially when compared with other countries the Vikings came in contact with. But no, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it sort of speaks to a connection that was continued for much longer, as well as sort of the Swedish in areas like Estonia and Latvia. I think you still have Swedish speakers there, and you definitely still have a large population in Finland that speaks Swedish. So it definitely speaks to a migration over from areas of what we now consider Sweden into what I think they called it Finnmark. So the march of the Finns, who are, I think that was their name for the Sami peoples, and it will be interesting to see the connection between those peoples. And we also know that they were giving tribute in the form of furs, because obviously the Sami were big hunters in the area. So it will have been an interesting relationship between them, very different to the let's say more civilized peoples, or people who were more sedentary, that they had interactions with. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions in the chat that they'd like answered? A strong genetic link. Yeah, I reckon there will be a genetic link as well, because I think the Finns are linguistically very different as well, because they obviously, I think, is it the Finno-Ugric languages that they speak?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's related to the Hungarians, and is it Estonian? Am I right in thinking?
Mm-hmm.
All right, okay, here's a good one, actually. Have you already talked about the connection between the Vikings and the Frisians? So this is a very interesting one I'm going to limit myself to 3 minutes of talking about this, because otherwise I will just go off on one. But it's something that I've been doing a little bit of research into. And it's quite an interesting one, because we don't have too many sources about this. The Frisians had been conquered by the Franks for the most part already. So there is definitely a raiding relationship there. So along the big rivers, so the Rhine today, as well as the various arms that go off the Rhine, the Vikings attacked there, because that was a very strong area of trade, very, very rich area. And we get in the 9th century, I think 810 is the first raid on Dorestad, or Dwarestead. It's called Vegberduurstede today. And actually recently they're building a Viking ship to sail there. If you are Dutch, then check that out in the next couple of months, and you should be able to sail and row a Viking ship up and down the Rhine. So that will be cool. But that little detour aside, and that gets raided an awful lot of the time. And we also have quite a lot of archaeology of the Vikings in Dorestad, so in the Rhine area, as well as them attacking other places. So the Great Heathen Army that attacks England in 865 also crossed over in the 870s to the continent and attacked down all of these rivers. Also, Nijmegen is attacked. There is question about this, and there's a great story. I think it's Nijmegen. That is attacked, and there's a story that there's a dragon that attacks it, and these two brothers help it. The dragon is probably a symbolic of the Vikings. Obviously, they come like dragons. They arrive and they burn things, and they sail away in the dragon ships. So that's sort of more talking about the lower Rhine area and Frisia. But also, what's interesting is that you have the more northern regions. So what's Friesland today, Noord-Holland, Groningen, and also into German areas. The relationship there seems to have been fairly different. Frankish control would be very weak here, I'm assuming, because you didn't have as many big settlements. The settlements you would have would be terpen, which are these man-made hills, because the land floods very often. And in these terpen, we find a very much mixed culture between the Norse and the Frisians. So I believe they found a very nice sword there. I'll have to get this up, and I'm definitely going to make a video about this in the future. But you have a very nice mixed culture with various Scandinavian items as well as Frisian. So it's possible to assume that the elite there would have been of Scandinavian origin, and that the other peoples would then still have been a Frisian origin, and that you'd have a various mix between the two there. And what's interesting as well is that we get various warlords that are mentioned, the Vikings, in various places. So, for example, on the Scheldt, which is the river, and on the island of Walcheren, we hear about Vikings. And in England, during the Great Heathen Army, we also get a leader who is called Ubba Dux Frisonum in Latin, so the Duke of the Frisians. And in some of the sources, we hear that the big Danish army that came over, almost knocked the lamp over again there. I need to stop talking with my hands. But we also hear that potentially that there was a Frisian contingent that came over. We hear about heathen Frisians and Danes came over and attacked. But these are slightly later sources, so we have to think, what's the origin? Why are they mentioning the Frisians there as well? But there's very much a potential that the Frisians joined in with Viking raids, as well as later fighting against them. So we also hear that joint armies of Frisians and Saxons fight against the Danes, for example, the Battle of Nordlingen, I believe that's 885 or 884, is led by Bishop Rimbert, and then also Frisians getting involved there, beating back the Danes. And as well, in sort of the 880s in the lower Rhine area, we get fortifications being built by the Franks and a real fight back against the Danes. And after that, we don't really hear much about the Danes in Friesland until I think it's the later 10th century. So they're really gave them a good hiding, because before that, Frisia had been a real base for Danish warlords, especially given as its central location between the eastern and western Frankish empires, and then the middle Frankish empire, which really was just beaten up by both sides, and then the Danes. So it's quite an interesting history. It's very complicated, but it's my ambition to one day write a book about Friesland in the Viking Age, or the Netherlands in the Viking Age, because I think there's been very few attempts at that, and I think it's a great shame. Oh, hey, thanks very much for coming, Goat Worn Armband. Keep up the memes. Very much enjoyed it. But yeah, so that's my answer to the Frisians in and the Vikings during this period.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I didn't know that much at all about sort of the Vikings in Frisia, and I agree. A book is absolutely necessary on that topic.
Yeah, I'll have to get down and do it at some point, actually. But it's just finding the time. Maybe over the summer. I'm not sure if people would be interested in that. I'm not sure. Just comment if you would be interested in reading something like that. All right. Yeah, no problem. Good question. So, okay, there was one more question that I had taken down from the questions already asked, which I think would be quite an interesting one, sort of winding towards the end of the stream. Would be, why didn't the Vikings colonize North America?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You know, in terms of, so the Vikings came to North America in, correct me if I'm wrong, Hilbert, would that have been the year 1000 AD?
Yeah, but I believe it's around then.
Yeah, approximately. Why didn't the Vikings discover North America? Well, obviously, we have discovered sort of the remnants of a possible settlement or some building structures in Vinland, which I believe is parts of modern day Canada. Then
I think it's called Lanzo the area where they found the Norse base.
So is that in modern day Newfoundland?
Yeah, I think that's in Newfoundland, right? But they recently thought that they discovered somewhere in Canada, but then it turned out not to be. Or I think, is that the case?
I don't know. That's really interesting. Yeah, and then of course we have the Vinland sagas, which are well known for, similar to the Icelandic saga Laxdæla saga, featuring characters who are strong female leads, which is really interesting. And it describes their in contact with the Native Americans, who they described as Skraelings. Why didn't the Vikings settle North America? I mean, well, the year in which they discovered it, the Viking Age was really winding down, and indeed the places which those Vikings who discovered North America would have come from, their original homelands would have been massively changing, undergoing a series of changes, just in due to, I mean, the conversion of Scandinavia, the formation of proper nations and kingdoms and nation states. But Hilbert, I'm curious, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I'd largely agree with that. I think there's several issues with North America. So I would say that the issues with North America are essentially a microcosm for what would happen in Greenland, because of course the Vikings colonized Greenland, and then later on, the colony fails completely. So I'd say if Greenland was a bridge too far, then North America would be a plank over a roaring river too far, as in way, way too much. So if you think about it as well, that you have Iceland, which is already dependent on Norway for supplies, then you also had Greenland. Hit the lamp again. Greenland, which was dependent on Iceland for supplies, which was dependent on Norway for supplies. Yeah. And if you then think North America was dependent on Greenland, which was dependent on Iceland, which was dependent on Norway, you can kind of see that the string of dependency was much too much. And for Greenland, it was already too much. And Greenland would fail. I think it's the 14th, 15th centuries that the Greenland colony fails. There's a few reasons. One is that the climate got colder, which meant that the sea straits were filled up with ice. It also meant that it was harder to produce wheat, which meant it was harder to feed cattle. And obviously cattle wasn't great to feed in Greenland anyway. And the real problem in North America was the Native Americans. They were, they possibly also, Vinland was possibly, if it's along the Micmac area, was possibly the most inhabited area in North America at the time. So it was the worst possible place they could have chosen. And as well was that most of the resources they could get in North America, they could get in Greenland and Iceland anyway, so there wasn't much reason to stay there. And also just because, well, there was lots of land in Greenland that hadn't been claimed yet, so there was no real reason for them to push on into North America because there was still land to be occupied in Greenland, and it was further away, and really just with sorry, just reading the chat. Yeah, and with the Native Americans, it just made it a lot harder, as it would in Greenland. So what happens in Greenland is eventually there were a tribe of Inuit living in Greenland first, the Dorset culture, who seemed to have been fairly peaceful, lived in fairly small communities, and they probably just traded with the Norse. But then later you get the Thule, who come from the north, and they wipe out the Dorset culture, and then probably wipe out the Greenlanders as well. So really what happens in North America, that they get there and then they're like, oh, it's a bit far, we should probably just stay on Greenland, and they are attacked by the Native Americans and chased away, is eventually what happens in Greenland as well, which is a very interesting link. But I need to make some in-depth videos about that, because I was lucky enough to have a lecture series on this by Dr. Or I think, is it Dr. Elizabeth Ashman Rowe, who I believe you talked to in a podcast, and she's just a fountain of knowledge on this. So if you are interested, I'll make some videos about this in the future. But yeah, those are basically some simple reasons why the colony in North America failed. I think it was just too far. There were too many natives. There was no real reason why they would go there, because they could get land and the resources they needed already. So really, it was just too far. But we do hear later on that there were expeditions to get wood there. Obviously, one of the places in North America that they named was Markland, which Mark is a word for wood as well. So we do get information that they did go there. And interestingly enough as well is that some of the tribes in North America where they came, and this is something that really blew me away, still have in their oral tradition stories of when these great swans with men come. And obviously if we read into the swans with men, and that these men have pale skin like snow, then we can date when these Vikings came. And it's really, really interesting if you look back at it. This was written down in the 19th century. We can date when these Vikings came, because in the native oral tradition, we still have stories of them coming to the New World before we get the other European colonization. So that's something that I thought was really interesting, that this was retained in the memory of native tribes in the area. And I can't remember exactly where these were, but I think it was in a tribe in Canada, I think, or the northern North America. But there's even a great debate about where Vinland exactly is, or whether it's Vinland or Vinland, whether it's Wineland or Meadowland, for example.
Yes.
No, 1 sec. No, hold on. I have to have ungone live. Are you still on, Noah?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Oh, cool. Yeah, you're back. I think it might have cut out for a second.
Oh no. Well, at least we've made it
All right.
without any technical difficulties. That's a miracle.
That's true. Apart from me knocking over the lamp several times, but that's all part of it, I guess. Okay, so how many more questions would you like to answer, Noah? I think maybe 1 or 2 more, and then we'll call it a night, because we've almost been at it for 2 hours, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that sounds perfect.
Okay, cool. So, all right, one question is the difference between the Anglo-Saxon invasions and the later Norse ones.
The difference between the Anglo-Saxon invasions and the later Norse ones.
Hmm.
Well, it depends sort of what you mean by the differences. In terms of militaries, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings would have looked extremely similar on the battlefield. Both lacked innovative, really very skilled battle tactics. I mean, obviously the shield wall was the most famous one. It was basically, get a bunch of guys together, line your shields up, point your spears out, and really hold this giant sort of wedge, this clump of humanity, form the line and defend it, or use it to push your enemy back as sort of this spearhead. And then there was some other tactics as well. But most of these tactics involved a bunch of men cooperating together. And then of course you had, some missile units. I shouldn't say missile units, but I should say the use of missile weapons, sort of the job of a skirmisher, as we would understand. But in terms of the differences between the Anglo-Saxon and Norse invasions, I mean, if you're looking at the motives of these invasions, it really depends sort of on what era, not what era, but sort of what aspect you're looking at here. I don't know, Hilbert, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I'd say there's definite similarities between the two. I mean, ultimately, they're probably derived from the same stock, especially if we look at the languages. You have a Northwest Germanic being spoken after Gothic moves off at some point. I think is it the third century or fourth century AD? But what's interesting is that they share many things. Obviously, the religion was closely related before the Anglo-Saxons converted, and also the kind of boat culture was probably something that was important in Anglo-Saxon times as well, because we do get the Sutton Hoo burial, for example, was also a longship inside a mound that very similar to the Norwegian one that's just been found. So that will have been something that was related. And as well, sort of, if we look at the invasion, I think the main difference is potentially the outcome. So if we look at England today, everywhere, speaks English. Apart from Cornwall, there was nowhere left in England, let's say by the 14th century when Cumbria stopped speaking Cumbric and started speaking English. So there's a real replacement culturally and also linguistically, probably not genetically as much as was once thought, but there's a real cultural replacement. Whereas with the Danes, you get the Danelaw, but obviously no one's speaking Danish in the north and east of England. So maybe one question we could ask is sort of why did one occur and why didn't the other? And potentially this has something to do with the number of the invaders. This maybe seems like the case with, if we look at genetic evidence, for example, or that one culture integrated more with the other, whereas another became a sort of socially more dominant culture than the other. That's also something to consider that went on. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's something I still need to do another response video to that article about how the Anglo-Saxons were worse than the Vikings by that Danish guy. I think he did actually write a big comment response, but I need to just take the time to go through it because there's still stuff that I need to, pick up on in that article that was quite ridiculous, in my opinion.
Whatever it is was the website with that, right?
Pardon?
Science Nordic, was that the website?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there was some very interesting assertions made about how the Anglo-Saxons ethnically cleansed Britain of Celts, which doesn't seem to be an interpretation that most genetic studies will, or even archaeological evidence will back up.
Right. Yeah, that's very curious. That's a curious notion.
Yeah. Okay. So another question that I thought was interesting that's quite different was how frequent was helmet usage during this period? So if I could just talk for a little bit, Noah, and then I'll hand over to you. Is that from a reenacting point of view, most of the archaeological evidence for people wounded in battle who were either killed in the groin somewhere or in the face. So wearing a helmet makes you feel a lot safer on the battlefield, and also it offers you so much more protection because the head is an easy area. It's high up. It's usually not going to be covered by your shield. The helmet would really add so much more protection. So I think we can say for, a career warrior, so a retainer, they would definitely be wearing a helmet, especially if you were a noble or a royal. And if we look at, for example, the Bayeux Tapestry, which seems to be a fairly good representation of what people would have worn at that time, we can see that pretty much everyone in the Bayeux Tapestry, apart from the Anglo-Saxons who are dressed in common gear, so in common tunics rather than in mail, that everyone is wearing a helmet there. So I think that's quite a key piece of evidence. We haven't found many helmets. That's the only thing. Part of the reason why we might not have found so many helmets is that helmets could be repurposed. You could make pots out of helmets or buckets, things like that. You could heat it up again and use the metal for something else. So I think that might be why we don't find many helmets, possibly also why we don't find too many shields either, because you could use the wood, you could for fire and for furniture and whatnot. So I think that might be one of the reasons we don't find too many helmets. But I think for career warriors, it definitely would have been very common to have a helmet, maybe even for people fighting often in the fjord to have a helm that was being made. And we do see on coins a lot of the time, kings in times of war start minting portraits of themselves, like Ethelred does, for example, with a helmet on. Possibly because they're forging more coins due to not coins, more helmets because of the Viking invasions that go on. Have you got many thoughts about sort of helmet usage during the period and how
Well, I
common that
think you
was?
just about covered, yeah, everything that I would say. Yeah, just metal during the Viking Age in general was something which was time consuming to construct objects of metal, and indeed required the skill of a craftsman, an experienced and knowledgeable craftsman. And it's the same thing with swords, the same story. It would have been expensive to produce. I think a lot of sort of the more nobility and aristocracy of medieval Scandinavia would have probably had their hands on helmets and more of the sort of proper armor. But yeah, I agree with everything you said, Hilbert.
Yeah, no, that's a good point as well. That metal was obviously not. So I think that's something important to keep in mind as well, especially with swords, because often you see lots of people using swords in historical programs, and far fewer spears than you would expect, because the spear really would be the staple weapon, because
Mhm.
it allows you to keep an enemy at a further range, and obviously you don't need much metal for a spear; it's mostly made of wood.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's definitely a good point to bring up that you obviously metal was expensive to use.
yeah, certainly.
All right, so I think that's pretty much most of the questions that we had. Maybe we can answer one more if there's something that a lot of people want to know before we call it a day here.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, one more question.
Cool. Oh, I've seen this one being asked a lot about the Norse combat. Um, about whether you'd have different fighting styles for each village. Now, I don't think I know enough to answer this, but I don't think that we have much evidence for this. I think in Okinawan karate, isn't it, that the different villages are all sort of on different islands, so they kind of have their different styles that they come up with. I might be wrong there, but I think I think the fighting styles would be pretty much the same region to region. We don't really hear about different fighting styles from different areas much.
Or
Uh,
really different, or really the usage of techniques, as you would see in like Asian martial arts.
yeah, I think there's a certain amount of that in Glima, I think, but not massively tactically minded. I think the tactics mostly come in with the long ships, how they can strike one area, then get horses and ride across the country as they do in 865. So first of all, they land in East Anglia, and then they get tribute and horses, and then they ride up to York and capture York, and then they use the long ships to sail up rivers like the Trent when they attacked Mercia, and obviously on the various attacks on Wessex as well, like Beamfleot. They also attacked with their ships, and I think the ships were what made them so deadly, because they could be anywhere and then out of there. Which sounds like another slogan, really, but I think that was a very important thing.
Absolutely.
All right, so I think that pretty much does it. So I hope we've answered most people's questions. We've definitely had a good discussion. I'm not sure exactly long how long it's been, how long we've been talking, but I feel like it's been a good amount of time.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, this was a lot of fun, Hilbert. Thanks so much for having me on your YouTube channel, and thank you all, everybody who came in to participate in the live stream. It's been fun hanging out with you guys and answering your questions.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for coming on. We actually have something coming at some point in the future of a little vlog in York where we have another sit down, ask another few questions, because Noah is actually recently an author, but plenty of that in the vlog that I'll upload. So if you're interested in more of his work, I will actually put a link in the description just after this video to his podcast where he talks to lots of experts. Really, really interesting stuff. Highly recommend that you watch it if you found anything in this video interesting. So yeah, thanks very much for coming, Noah. Thank you very much for coming and offering your opinions and your massive wealth of knowledge on this period. And thank to you guys for coming along and for asking your questions and for listening in. All right, everyone. So this has been History with Hilbert and History of Vikings podcast. So for me, good night, and I will see you all very soon. Thanks very much, Noah.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Cheers. All right. Ta-ra.